In the mountains of Afghanistan, where death whispered through every shadow and survival meant trusting strangers with your life, Marine sniper Sarah Chin never imagined she would become the last hope for an elite SEAL team trapped behind enemy lines. What started as a routine surveillance mission would transform into a deadly game of cat and mouse, where one woman's precision with a rifle would determine whether 12 of America's finest warriors would return home or become another statistic in an endless war. The morning sun painted the Afghan mountains in shades of gold and crimson as Marine Gunnery Sergeant Sarah Chin adjusted her scope for the third time in 20 minutes. Her position on the rocky outcropping provided a clear view of the valley below, where intelligence reports suggested Taliban fighters had established a weapons cache. What she saw through her scope, however, was not what anyone had expected. Sarah had been deployed to Afghanistan for 18 months, and in that time, she had earned a reputation as one of the most skilled snipers in the Marine Corps. Her record was impressive, but more importantly, she had never lost a Marine under her watch. Today, she was providing overwatch for SEAL Team 7, a group of 12 elite Navy SEALs conducting a reconnaissance mission in the treacherous terrain of Helmand Province. The mission briefing had seemed straightforward enough. Intelligence indicated that a high-value target, a Taliban commander known as the Ghost, was using the valley as a staging area for attacks against coalition forces. The SEALs were to gather intelligence on enemy movements and identify the exact location of the weapons cache. Sarah's job was to provide cover from her elevated position, watching for threats and ready to eliminate any enemies that might compromise the mission. Through her scope, Sarah watched as the SEAL team moved like shadows through the rocky terrain. Their leader, Lieutenant Commander Marcus Rivera, was a 20-year veteran with 4 deployments under his belt. His team was composed of the finest operators the Navy had to offer, each man a specialist in his own right. There was Chief Petty Officer James "Tank" Morrison, the team's heavy weapons specialist whose massive frame belied his ability to move silently through enemy territory. Petty Officer First Class David "Ghost" Williams earned his nickname for his uncanny ability to appear and disappear without a trace. The team also included explosive ordnance specialists, communications experts, and medics, all working together as a cohesive unit. Everything was proceeding according to plan when Sarah noticed movement in her peripheral vision. Through her scope, she could see figures moving along the ridge lines on both sides of the valley. Her heart rate increased as she counted the positions. What she saw made her blood run cold. The SEAL team wasn't walking into a routine reconnaissance mission. They were walking into a carefully orchestrated trap. The Taliban fighters were positioned in a classic L-shaped ambush formation, with machine gun nests established at key choke points throughout the valley. Sarah counted at least 40 enemy fighters, all armed with AK-47 assault rifles, rocket-propelled grenades, and what appeared to be a heavy machine gun positioned on the northern ridge. The weapons cache the SEALs were investigating was nothing more than bait, designed to lure American forces into a kill zone. Sarah immediately keyed her radio to warn the SEAL team, but static filled her earpiece. The enemy had somehow managed to jam their communications, cutting off the SEALs from both her position and their command base. She watched helplessly as the 12-man team continued their advance, unaware of the deadly trap closing around them. The first shots rang out when the SEALs were approximately 500 meters into the valley. The Taliban fighters opened fire simultaneously from multiple positions, creating a devastating crossfire that sent the SEALs scrambling for whatever cover they could find among the scattered boulders and dried creek beds. Sarah could see muzzle flashes erupting from positions all around the valley as the enemy unleashed everything they had. Through her scope, Sarah watched Lieutenant Commander Rivera shouting orders to his men, but she couldn't hear his words over the thunderous gunfire echoing through the mountains. The SEALs had taken cover behind a cluster of large rocks near the center of the valley, but their position offered limited protection and no escape route. Enemy fire was coming from 3 sides, and Sarah could see Taliban fighters moving to surround the trapped Americans completely. The heavy machine gun on the northern ridge opened fire, sending tracers streaming across the valley and forcing the SEALs to keep their heads down. Rocket-propelled grenades began exploding around their position, sending deadly fragments of metal and rock in all directions. Sarah could see that at least 2 of the SEALs had been wounded in the initial assault, though they were still returning fire. From her elevated position, Sarah had a clear field of fire to most of the enemy positions, but she was faced with an impossible situation. There were too many targets, and she was just one person with a rifle. Even if she could eliminate some of the Taliban fighters, there were still dozens more, and her position would be compromised the moment she fired her first shot. Once the enemy located her, they would turn their weapons on her position, and she would be unable to provide any further assistance to the trapped SEALs. But Sarah knew she couldn't just watch as 12 of America's finest warriors were systematically destroyed by an enemy that had planned this ambush perfectly. She had to do something, even if it meant sacrificing her own life in the process. The question was how to maximize her effectiveness while staying alive long enough to make a real difference. Sarah studied the enemy positions through her scope, looking for the most critical targets. The heavy machine gun on the northern ridge was doing the most damage, keeping the SEALs pinned down and preventing them from maneuvering to a better position. If she could eliminate the machine gun crew, it might give the SEALs a chance to break out of the kill zone. She also identified what appeared to be a Taliban commander positioned on the eastern ridge, easily recognizable by the way other fighters were looking to him for orders. Taking out the commander might cause confusion among the enemy ranks, though it wouldn't eliminate the threat entirely. The radio jamming was another major problem. Sarah could see what looked like a communications setup on the southern ridge, with antenna arrays and electronic equipment clearly visible. Destroying the jamming equipment might restore communications between the SEALs and their support units, potentially bringing in air support or additional ground forces. As Sarah considered her options, she watched the Taliban fighters beginning to maneuver for a final assault on the SEALs' position. Enemy fighters were moving down from the ridge lines, using the terrain to get closer to the trapped Americans. She estimated that the SEALs had perhaps 10 minutes before they would be overrun completely. The weight of the decision pressed down on Sarah like a physical force. She had trained for situations like this, but no amount of training could fully prepare someone for the reality of watching fellow warriors fighting for their lives while being the only person in a position to help them. Every second of hesitation meant that the trapped SEALs were one step closer to death. Sarah took a deep breath and made her choice. She would engage the enemy, starting with the most critical targets and working her way down the list. She knew that once she fired her first shot, she would become a target herself, but that was a risk she was willing to take. The lives of 12 SEALs depended on her ability to disrupt the ambush and give them a fighting chance. She chambered around and adjusted her scope for the distance to the heavy machine gun position. The crew consisted of 3 Taliban fighters, the gunner, an assistant gunner feeding ammunition, and a spotter directing their fire. Sarah placed the crosshairs on the gunner's center mass and controlled her breathing, waiting for the perfect moment to take her first shot. The mountain wind was calm, and visibility was excellent. Range to target was approximately 800 meters, well within Sarah's effective range. She had made shots at greater distances under more difficult conditions, but never with so much at stake. The lives of 12 men depended on her accuracy and her ability to remain undetected for as long as possible. As Sarah prepared to squeeze the trigger, she caught sight of movement among the SEAL team's position. Through her scope, she could see Lieutenant Commander Rivera attempting to signal someone, though she couldn't determine who he was trying to communicate with. It was possible that he had spotted her position and was trying to coordinate with her, though without radio communication, there was no way to be certain. The Taliban fighters continued their advance, and Sarah knew she was out of time. Whether the SEALs knew she was there or not, she had to act immediately if any of them were going to survive the next few minutes. She settled her crosshairs on the machine gunner, took one final breath, and prepared to begin what would become the most important engagement of her military career. Sarah's first shot split the morning air like thunder rolling through the mountains. The .308 Winchester round traveled the 800 meters to its target in just over a second, striking the machine gunner's center mass and dropping him instantly. The heavy machine gun fell silent, its deadly stream of fire suddenly cut off as the gunner collapsed over his weapon. The effect on the battlefield was immediate and dramatic. The sudden silence from the northern ridge caused confusion among the Taliban fighters, who had been coordinating their assault around the suppressing fire from the heavy weapon. The trapped SEALs, recognizing the opportunity, immediately began returning more effective fire against the enemy positions. But Sarah knew she had perhaps 30 seconds before the Taliban fighters identified her position and began directing fire toward her. She had to make every shot count. Without hesitation, she shifted her aim to the assistant gunner who was attempting to take over the machine gun. Her second shot took him down before he could bring the weapon back into action. The spotter, realizing his position was compromised, began scrambling toward cover. Sarah tracked him through her scope, leading his movement and squeezing the trigger just as he dove behind a boulder. The shot caught him mid-flight, and he tumbled lifelessly to the ground. In less than 2 minutes, Sarah had eliminated the entire machine gun crew and neutralized the most dangerous weapon on the battlefield. Enemy fighters throughout the valley began shouting and pointing toward the ridge where Sarah was positioned. She could see muzzle flashes erupting from multiple locations as Taliban fighters began firing in her general direction, though most of their shots were going wide. Her elevated position and the distance involved made her a difficult target, but she knew it was only a matter of time before they found the range. Sarah quickly shifted her attention to the communications equipment on the southern ridge. If she could destroy the jamming equipment, the SEALs might be able to call for air support or artillery strikes that could break up the ambush entirely. She could see 2 Taliban fighters operating the electronic equipment, working frantically to maintain their communications advantage. Her fourth shot struck the primary radio operator, sending him sprawling across his equipment. The second operator grabbed for a rifle, but Sarah's fifth shot found its mark before he could bring his weapon to bear. She then shifted her aim to the antenna arrays themselves, sending 2 more rounds into the electronic equipment, and watching with satisfaction as sparks flew and smoke began rising from the destroyed gear. The jamming suddenly ceased, and Sarah immediately heard voices crackling through her earpiece as communications were restored. Lieutenant Commander Rivera's voice came through clearly, calling for immediate air support and artillery strikes on the enemy positions surrounding his team. Overwatch, this is SEAL 7 Actual. Rivera's voice was calm despite the desperate situation. We are taking heavy fire from multiple positions. Request immediate close air support and artillery on grid coordinates I am about to transmit. Sarah keyed her radio and responded, SEAL 7 Actual, this is Marine Overwatch. I have eyes on your position and am engaging enemy targets. Air support is 15 minutes out. I'll keep the pressure on until they arrive. Copy that, Marine Overwatch. Your shots on the northern ridge saved our lives. We've got wounded and need to get to an extraction point. Can you provide cover while we move? Sarah scanned the battlefield through her scope, counting enemy positions and assessing the threat level. The elimination of the machine gun crew and the communications jamming had definitely disrupted the Taliban's plans, but there were still more than 30 enemy fighters positioned throughout the valley. Many of them were now focused on finding and eliminating her, but others continued to pour fire down on the trapped SEALs. SEAL 7 Actual, I count at least 30 enemy combatants still active. I can provide cover, but you'll need to move quickly. I recommend moving to the eastern side of your current position where the rocks provide better cover. I'll engage targets on your western flank to give you a corridor. Roger that, Marine Overwatch. Give us 30 seconds to prepare wounded for movement, then start your covering fire. Sarah used those 30 seconds to identify her next targets. She could see a group of Taliban fighters positioned on the western ridge who had a clear line of sight to the route the SEALs would need to take. There were at least 6 fighters in that position, armed with assault rifles and what appeared to be a rocket-propelled grenade launcher. When Rivera signaled that his team was ready to move, Sarah immediately engaged the Western Ridge position. Her shots came in rapid succession, each one carefully aimed and precisely placed. The first Taliban fighter fell before he could fire his RPG. The second spun and dropped as Sarah's bullet found its mark. A third fighter attempted to take cover behind a rock outcropping, but Sarah adjusted her aim and sent a round through the gap, striking him in the shoulder and spinning him out of cover where a follow-up shot finished him. The remaining fighters on the Western Ridge began firing wildly in Sarah's direction, but their shots were inaccurate due to the distance and their panic. Sarah continued her methodical elimination of targets, working from left to right along the ridgeline. Each shot was deliberate and controlled, despite the increasing volume of return fire coming her way. Meanwhile, the SEAL team began their movement toward better cover on the eastern side of the valley. Sarah could see them moving in pairs, with one element providing covering fire while the other moved. 2 of the SEALs were clearly wounded, being supported by their teammates, but all 12 men were still mobile and fighting. As the SEALs moved, Taliban fighters on the southern ridge attempted to shift position to maintain their line of fire on the Americans. Sarah immediately engaged these targets, dropping 2 fighters who were trying to flank the SEAL team's new position. Her shots forced the remaining Taliban fighters to keep their heads down, allowing the SEALs to reach better cover without taking additional casualties. The enemy commander on the eastern ridge, recognizing that his ambush was falling apart, began shouting orders to his men. Sarah could see him directing fighters to new positions, trying to reorganize his forces and regain the initiative. She placed her crosshairs on the commander's chest and squeezed the trigger, watching as the Taliban leader pitched forward and rolled down the rocky slope. The death of their commander sent visible shock waves through the Taliban ranks. Without clear leadership, the enemy fighters began firing more erratically and making tactical mistakes. Some broke cover too early, presenting Sarah with easier targets. Others bunched up together, allowing her to engage multiple targets from the same firing position. Sarah's ammunition was running low, and she knew she needed to conserve her remaining rounds for the most critical targets. She had started the engagement with 20 rounds in her magazine, plus 1 in the chamber, and she had already fired 15 shots. Every remaining bullet had to count if she was going to keep the SEALs alive until air support arrived. She could hear the distant sound of helicopters approaching from the south, but they were still several minutes away. The Taliban fighters, recognizing that American air power was coming, began preparing to withdraw from their positions. Some were already gathering their equipment and beginning to move toward escape routes higher up in the mountains. But a hardcore group of perhaps 15 fighters remained in position, determined to kill the trapped Americans before the helicopters could intervene. These fighters had good cover and disciplined fire control, making them much more dangerous than the others. Sarah could see them coordinating their movements, preparing for a final assault on the SEAL team's position. Marine Overwatch. This is SEAL 7 Actual. Rivera's voice crackled through the radio. We can see air support approaching, but we've got a group of fighters massing for an assault on our eastern flank. Can you engage those targets? Sarah shifted her scope toward the eastern flank and immediately saw the threat. A group of Taliban fighters had worked their way down from the ridge and were now positioned behind a series of boulders less than 200 meters from the SEALs' position. They were armed with assault rifles and grenades, and they clearly intended to rush the American position before the helicopters could intervene. I see them. SEAL 7 Actual. 15 targets at your 2 o'clock. Range approximately 200 meters. I'll engage immediately. Sarah's remaining shots had to be perfect. At this range, the Taliban fighters posed an immediate and deadly threat to the SEALs, but her elevated position meant she was shooting at a steep downward angle, which complicated her ballistics calculations. She had to account for the angle, the distance, and the fact that some of the targets were partially concealed behind cover. Her 16th shot took down the lead Taliban fighter just as he was preparing to signal the assault. The 17th dropped a fighter who was armed with grenades. Sarah's 18th shot struck a Taliban fighter who was providing covering fire for the others, eliminating his ability to suppress the SEALs during the assault. With 3 rounds remaining, Sarah had to choose her targets carefully. The Taliban fighters, realizing they were being systematically eliminated by a sniper they couldn't see, began their assault early, rushing from cover toward the SEAL team's position. Sarah's 19th shot dropped the fighter who appeared to be leading the charge. Her 20th caught another fighter mid-stride, sending him tumbling into the rocks. Sarah's final round was chambered and ready when she saw a Taliban fighter rise from cover with an RPG aimed directly at the clustered SEAL team. The range was close enough that a rocket-propelled grenade could easily kill or wound multiple Americans with a single shot. Sarah placed her crosshairs on the fighter's center mass and squeezed the trigger for what she knew would be her final shot of the engagement. The round struck the Taliban fighter just as he was preparing to fire his RPG. The impact sent him backward, and the rocket-propelled grenade fired harmlessly into the air, exploding against the mountainside far from any American positions. Sarah's rifle was now empty, but the immediate threat to the SEALs had been eliminated. The sound of helicopter rotors was now clearly audible, and Sarah could see 2 Apache attack helicopters approaching the valley at high speed. The remaining Taliban fighters, recognizing that they were about to face American air power, began a hasty withdrawal toward the high ground, abandoning their weapons and equipment in their haste to escape. Sarah had fired 21 rounds and eliminated at least 16 confirmed targets, possibly more. She had single-handedly broken up a carefully planned ambush and kept 12 SEALs alive until air support could arrive. But she knew the mission wasn't over yet. The Taliban fighters might regroup and return, and there was still the matter of extracting the SEAL team from the hostile territory. The Apache helicopters swept into the valley like mechanical predators, their 30mm chain guns and Hellfire missiles turning the remaining Taliban positions into clouds of dust and debris. Sarah watched from her elevated position as the attack helicopters systematically destroyed enemy fighting positions that had threatened the SEAL team just minutes earlier. The thunderous roar of the Apache weapons systems echoed off the mountain walls, a stark reminder of American military superiority when it could be properly brought to bear. But even as the immediate threat was being neutralized, Sarah knew the situation was far from over. Through her scope, she could see Taliban fighters withdrawing to higher positions in the mountains, and her experience told her they weren't running away in panic. They were conducting an organized withdrawal, which meant they still had leadership and they still had a plan. Lieutenant Commander Rivera's voice crackled through her earpiece, confirming her suspicions. Marine Overwatch, this is SEAL 7 Actual. We've got 2 urgent casualties who need immediate medical evacuation, but our planned extraction point is compromised. Enemy fighters have repositioned to overlook the landing zone, and we're going to need a new plan. Sarah scanned the surrounding terrain, looking for alternative extraction routes and enemy positions. What she saw made her heart sink. The Taliban fighters hadn't just withdrawn randomly. They had moved to positions that dominated all the obvious helicopter landing zones in the area. Whoever was commanding the enemy forces was clearly an experienced military leader who understood American tactics and procedures. SEAL 7 Actual, I can see enemy positions on ridges overlooking all primary landing zones, Sarah reported. Count at least 20 fighters in overwatch positions with what appears to be heavy weapons. They're waiting for us to call in extraction birds. The situation had evolved from a rescue mission into something more complex and dangerous. The Taliban had clearly planned for multiple contingencies, and they weren't going to give up easily. Sarah realized that the initial ambush had been just the first phase of their operation. Now, they were implementing Phase 2, preventing the Americans from extracting safely from the area. Apache Flight, this is SEAL 7 Actual. Rivera called to the attack helicopters. Can you engage enemy positions on the northern and eastern ridges? We need those positions clear before we can call an extraction. The lead Apache pilot's response was immediate and professional, but not what the ground forces wanted to hear. SEAL 7 Actual, this is Apache lead. We're running low on fuel and ammunition after our initial engagement. We can provide cover for another 15 minutes maximum before we need to return to base for refuel and rearm. 15 minutes wasn't nearly enough time to clear all the enemy positions and conduct a safe extraction. Sarah knew that once the Apaches departed, the Taliban fighters would move back into position and the deadly game would continue. The SEALs were still trapped, and now they had wounded men who needed immediate medical attention. Sarah made a quick inventory of her remaining equipment. She had her pistol with two 15-round magazines, several fragmentation grenades, and her combat knife. She also carried emergency medical supplies, extra water, and a small amount of food. Most importantly, she had a second ammunition magazine for her sniper rifle, giving her another 20 rounds of .308 Winchester. An idea began forming in Sarah's mind, but it was dangerous and would require her to leave her current position and move closer to the enemy. The Taliban fighters were positioned on multiple ridges, but they were focused on watching the valley below where the SEALs were located. If Sarah could work her way around to higher ground behind the enemy positions, she might be able to engage them from an unexpected direction. SEAL 7 Actual, this is Marine Overwatch, Sarah called. I'm going to reposition to engage enemy forces from a different angle. Maintain your current position and be ready to move to extraction when I give you the all clear. Negative Marine Overwatch. Too dangerous for you to move alone through enemy territory. We'll wait for additional air support. Sarah understood Rivera's concern, but she also knew that additional air support might not arrive in time to save the wounded SEALs. Medical evacuation helicopters couldn't land under fire, and the Taliban fighters were clearly prepared to wait as long as necessary to prevent American extraction from the area. SEAL 7 Actual, your wounded can't wait for additional air support. I'm moving to engage. We'll maintain radio contact and call for extraction once threats are neutralized. Before Rivera could respond, Sarah began packing her equipment for movement. She cached most of her heavier gear, keeping only her rifle, ammunition, pistol, grenades, water, and medical supplies. The route she planned would take her around the backside of the mountain, through terrain the Taliban fighters wouldn't expect anyone to traverse. The climb was treacherous, requiring Sarah to move carefully across loose rock and steep slopes while carrying her weapons and equipment. She had to be extremely quiet, as sound carried far in the thin mountain air, and any noise could alert enemy sentries to her movement. Progress was slow, but after 45 minutes of careful climbing, she reached a position above and behind the main Taliban position on the eastern ridge. Through her scope, Sarah could see the enemy fighters clearly for the first time since the engagement began. There were 18 men positioned along the ridge, all well-armed and disciplined. They had established good fields of fire covering the valley below, and they clearly had no intention of withdrawing. Several fighters carried modern military equipment that was definitely not standard Taliban issue, including what appeared to be advanced radio gear and night vision devices. Sarah realized she might be facing more than just local Taliban fighters. The equipment and tactics suggested the presence of foreign advisors or possibly special operations forces from a hostile nation. This would explain the sophisticated planning and execution of the ambush, as well as the disciplined response when their initial attack failed. The enemy position was too spread out for Sarah to engage effectively with her rifle alone. She would need to get closer and use her grenades to disrupt their formation before picking off individual targets with precision fire. This meant moving to within 50 meters of enemy fighters who were actively searching for American forces to kill. Sarah spent 10 minutes studying the enemy position and planning her approach. The Taliban fighters were positioned along a ridge line that extended for about 200 meters, with small groups of 2 or 3 men spaced along the crest. They had good cover from rocks and scrub vegetation, but their positions were designed to provide fields of fire downward into the valley, not to defend against attack from above and behind. The wind was in Sarah's favor, carrying any sound away from the enemy position. She began her approach by moving to within throwing distance of the northernmost group of fighters. These 3 men were positioned around a heavy machine gun similar to the one she had eliminated earlier, and they posed the greatest threat to any helicopter attempting to land in the valley. Sarah pulled the pin on her first fragmentation grenade and let the safety spoon fly free. She counted down the fuse time in her head, then lobbed the grenade perfectly into the enemy position. The explosion sent all 3 Taliban fighters sprawling, eliminating the machine gun threat and creating chaos among the other enemy positions along the ridge. Before the remaining fighters could react, Sarah was already moving to her next position. The Taliban fighters began shouting to each other in Pashto, trying to determine where the attack had come from. Several began firing wildly in various directions, but none of their shots came close to Sarah's position. She threw her second grenade at a group of 4 fighters positioned near the center of the ridgeline. The explosion caught 2 of them directly and wounded the other 2 severely enough to put them out of action. Sarah then brought her rifle to bear and began engaging individual targets with precision fire. Her first shot dropped a Taliban fighter who was attempting to coordinate the defense of their position. Her second eliminated a fighter who was moving to set up a rocket-propelled grenade launcher. Sarah worked methodically from north to south along the ridgeline, taking advantage of the confusion created by her grenade attacks to eliminate targets before they could organize an effective response. The remaining Taliban fighters realized they were being attacked from their rear by a single sniper, and several began attempting to reposition to engage her. Sarah threw her third grenade to discourage this movement, then continued her systematic elimination of targets. Each shot was carefully aimed and precisely placed, conserving ammunition while maximizing effectiveness. By the time the shooting stopped, Sarah had eliminated 17 of the 18 Taliban fighters on the eastern ridge. The sole survivor had fled toward higher ground, abandoning his weapons and equipment in his haste to escape. The immediate threat to helicopter extraction had been neutralized, but Sarah knew there were still enemy forces on other ridges that would need to be dealt with. She immediately called Rivera with an update. SEAL 7 Actual. This is Marine Overwatch. Eastern Ridge is clear. Count 17 enemy Kia, 1 escaped. Moving to engage Northern Ridge position now. Outstanding work, Marine Overwatch. Apache Flight is reporting enemy movement on Northern Ridge. Approximately 12 fighters with heavy weapons. Medical evacuation helicopter is standing by at base, ready to launch once all threats are neutralized. Sarah began moving toward the Northern Ridge position, but she knew this engagement would be more difficult. The Taliban fighters there had heard the fighting on the Eastern Ridge and would be alert and prepared for attack. She would need to approach more carefully and use different tactics to achieve surprise. As she moved through the rocky terrain, Sarah reflected on what she had accomplished. She had eliminated more than 30 enemy fighters in a single engagement, broken up a sophisticated ambush, and kept 12 SEALs alive against overwhelming odds. But the mission wasn't over yet, and the most dangerous part might still lie ahead. The Northern Ridge was higher and more exposed than the previous position, offering fewer approach routes and less cover for her movements. The Taliban fighters there would have better fields of observation and more time to react to any attack. Sarah would need to use every skill she had learned in her years as a Marine sniper if she was going to complete the mission and bring everyone home alive. The Northern Ridge loomed ahead of Sarah like a fortress wall, its rocky face dotted with enemy positions that commanded perfect fields of fire over the entire valley. As she studied the terrain through her binoculars, she could see that the 12 Taliban fighters positioned there had learned from the fate of their comrades on the Eastern Ridge. They had repositioned themselves in a defensive formation with overlapping fields of fire and multiple fallback positions prepared. Unlike the previous engagement, where Sarah had achieved tactical surprise by approaching from an unexpected direction, this time the enemy was ready for her. She could see sentries posted at key points along the ridge, scanning the surrounding terrain for any sign of movement. The remaining fighters were positioned around 2 heavy weapons, a recoilless rifle that could destroy any helicopter attempting to land in the valley, and another heavy machine gun that could sweep the entire area with deadly fire. Sarah realized that a direct assault on this position would be suicide. The enemy had too many advantages: high ground, prepared positions, heavy weapons, and advance warning of her approach. She needed a different strategy, something that would allow her to neutralize the threat without exposing herself to overwhelming enemy fire. As she considered her options, Sarah noticed something that might work in her favor. The northern ridge was connected to her current position by a narrow trail that wound around the back of the mountain. The trail was treacherous and would take hours to traverse, but it would allow her to approach the enemy position from a direction they might not expect. More importantly, there was a depression in the ground about 300 meters from the enemy position that would provide concealment for a different kind of attack. The plan that formed in Sarah's mind was risky and unconventional, but it might be the only way to eliminate the threat without getting herself killed in the process. Instead of trying to fight her way through the enemy position, she would use her knowledge of explosives and mountain warfare to turn the terrain itself into a weapon. Sarah had noticed that the enemy position was located just below a large overhang of loose rock that appeared to be held in place by only a few key support points. If she could position her remaining grenades correctly and detonate them in sequence, she might be able to trigger a rock slide that would bury the enemy position entirely. It was a long shot, but it was better than trying to fight 12 well-positioned enemies with superior firepower. The approach took Sarah 2 hours of careful movement through terrain that would challenge an experienced mountain climber even under ideal conditions. She had to cross several exposed areas where enemy sentries might spot her movement, and the loose rock underfoot threatened to send cascades of stones rattling down the mountainside with every step. Halfway to her objective, Sarah received an urgent radio call from Lieutenant Commander Rivera. "Marine Overwatch, this is SEAL 7 Actual. Our wounded are deteriorating rapidly. One man is going to shock from blood loss, and we need immediate medical evacuation. How long until Northern Ridge is clear?" Sarah checked her watch and calculated the time she would need to reach her planned position and execute her attack. SEAL 7 Actual. Estimate 45 minutes to neutralize Northern Ridge threat. Can your wounded hold on that long? We're doing everything we can for them, but they need a trauma surgeon and blood transfusions. 45 minutes might be too long. The weight of responsibility settled on Sarah's shoulders like a physical burden. Every minute of delay increased the likelihood that one or both of the wounded SEALs would die from their injuries. She had to find a way to accelerate her timeline without compromising the mission. Sarah made the difficult decision to take a more direct but dangerous route to her objective. Instead of following the safer trail around the mountain, she would climb straight up the rocky face to reach the position above the enemy fighters. The climb would be treacherous and would expose her to enemy observation for several minutes, but it would cut her travel time in half. The ascent was one of the most difficult physical challenges Sarah had ever faced. The rock face was nearly vertical in places, requiring her to use her combat knife as a climbing tool while carrying her rifle and remaining equipment. Several times she nearly lost her footing on loose rock that crumbled away under her weight, and once she had to hang by her fingertips for nearly a minute while looking for a new handhold. After 20 minutes of desperate climbing, Sarah reached the top of the ridge and found herself looking down at the enemy position from directly above. The Taliban fighters were so focused on watching the approaches from below that none of them thought to look up. Sarah was now in position to execute her plan, but she had to work quickly and quietly to avoid detection. She carefully examined the rock formation above the enemy position, looking for the key structural points that were holding the overhang in place. She identified 3 critical areas where the placement of grenades might trigger the rock slide she needed. The challenge would be positioning the explosives accurately and timing their detonation to achieve maximum effect. Sarah's remaining grenades had to be placed with surgical precision. The first would go at the northern end of the overhang, where a crack in the rock suggested a natural weakness. The second would be positioned at the center, directly above the heavy weapons positions. The third would be placed at the southern end, where the rock formation connected to the main mountain face. Moving silently across the rocky ground, Sarah positioned her first grenade at the northern end of the overhang. She pulled the pin, but held the safety spoon in place, preventing the fuse from igniting. She would need to release all 3 spoons simultaneously to achieve the coordinated detonation necessary for her plan to work. The placement of the second grenade required Sarah to crawl to within 50 meters of the enemy position below. She could hear the Taliban fighters talking quietly among themselves, and she could smell the smoke from their cigarettes drifting up from their positions. Any noise or sudden movement would alert them to her presence and bring their weapons to bear on her exposed position. Sarah placed the second grenade carefully in a crack that would direct the explosive force downward into the rock formation. She was now committed to her course of action. There was no way to retreat safely with 3 armed grenades positioned above an enemy force that would kill her without hesitation if they discovered her presence. The third grenade position was the most dangerous, requiring Sarah to move to within 30 meters of the enemy sentries. She could see individual Taliban fighters clearly through the gaps in the rock, and she could hear them discussing their plans for destroying any American helicopters that attempted to land in the valley below. As Sarah positioned the final grenade, one of the enemy sentries stood up and began walking in her direction. Her heart pounded as she realized he might be conducting a routine security patrol that would bring him directly to her position. She had perhaps 60 seconds before he would be close enough to see her, and once the shooting started, she would have no chance of survival against 12 enemy fighters. Sarah made a split-second decision that would either save the mission or end her life. Instead of waiting for the optimal moment to detonate her charges, she would trigger them immediately and hope that the resulting rockslide would be sufficient to eliminate the enemy threat. She released the safety spoon on the third grenade, then quickly moved to release the other 2. The 3 grenades detonated within seconds of each other, sending tremendous explosive forces through the rock formation above the enemy position. The effect was even more dramatic than Sarah had hoped. The explosions triggered a massive rock slide that sent thousands of tons of stone cascading down onto the Taliban fighters below. The sound was deafening, like thunder rolling endlessly through the mountains. When the dust finally settled, the entire enemy position had been buried under 20 feet of rock and debris. Not a single Taliban fighter had survived the avalanche, and their heavy weapons had been completely destroyed. Sarah immediately called Rivera with the news. SEAL 7 Actual, this is Marine Overwatch. Northern Ridge is clear. All enemy positions neutralized. Valley is secure for helicopter extraction. Outstanding work, Marine Overwatch. Medical evacuation helicopter is airborne and will be on station in 10 minutes. You've saved 12 lives today. As Sarah began her descent from the ridge, she reflected on what had just occurred. She had single-handedly eliminated more than 40 enemy fighters and broken up a sophisticated ambush that could have resulted in the complete destruction of an elite SEAL team. Her actions had prevented what would have been one of the worst American military disasters in Afghanistan. But even as she felt a sense of accomplishment, Sarah knew that the real victory would come only when all 12 SEALs were safely aboard the medical evacuation helicopter and on their way to proper medical treatment. The mission wouldn't be complete until every American warrior was out of harm's way and heading home. The sound of helicopter rotors echoed through the valley as the medical evacuation bird approached the now secure landing zone. Sarah watched from her elevated position as the aircraft settled onto the rocky ground, and medical personnel rushed to assist the wounded SEALs. Within minutes, all 12 members of SEAL Team 7 were aboard the helicopter and lifting off towards safety. As the helicopter disappeared over the horizon, Sarah began the long journey back to her original position to retrieve her cached equipment. She had completed one of the most remarkable single-handed military actions in modern combat history, but She knew that her story would likely remain classified for years to come. The SEALs she had saved would return to their families, and that was all the recognition she needed. 3 weeks after the mountain engagement, Sarah Chun sat in a sterile military hospital room in Germany, watching Lieutenant Commander Marcus Rivera slowly regain consciousness after his 3rd surgery. The shrapnel wounds he had sustained during the ambush had been more serious than initially assessed, requiring multiple operations to repair damage to his liver and intestines. But he was alive, and that was what mattered. Rivera's eyes focused on Sarah's face, and a weak smile crossed his features. "You're real," he whispered hoarsely. "For a while there, I thought maybe I had imagined the whole thing. One Marine sniper against 40 Taliban fighters? It sounded like something out of a movie." Sarah returned his smile and pulled her chair closer to his bed. "How are you feeling, Commander?" "Like I got hit by a truck, but alive thanks to you." Rivera's expression grew more serious. "The doctors tell me that Chief Morrison and Petty Officer Williams are going to make full recoveries. Williams lost his spleen and part of his lung, but he'll be back to full duty in 6 months. Morrison has some nerve damage in his left arm, but the surgeons think they can repair most of it." The relief in Rivera's voice was evident. During the helicopter evacuation from the mountain, it had been uncertain whether either of the wounded SEALs would survive their injuries. The fact that both men would eventually return to their families was a testament to the skill of the military medical personnel and the speed with which they had been evacuated from the combat zone. "What about the rest of the team?" Sarah asked. "Scratched up, but intact. Ghost Williams insisted on staying here until we knew Morrison was going to be okay. The rest of the team has been debriefed and sent back to their families. They all asked me to thank you personally when I saw you." Rivera paused, studying Sarah's face carefully. "The investigation into the ambush has revealed some interesting information. Those weren't just local Taliban fighters we encountered. Intelligence analysis indicates that at least half of them were foreign fighters with advanced military training. The equipment they were using included Russian-made communications gear and Chinese night vision devices." This confirmation of Sarah's battlefield assessment didn't surprise her, but it did validate her decision to take such aggressive action during the engagement. A force of that caliber wouldn't have been defeated by conventional tactics, and any hesitation on her part would likely have resulted in the complete destruction of the SEAL team. "There's something else," Rivera continued. "The brass wants to put you in for the Medal of Honor. A single Marine eliminating 40-plus enemy fighters and saving an entire SEAL team? That's the kind of action that earns our highest decoration." Sarah shook her head immediately. "I don't want any medals, Commander. I was just doing my job. With all due respect, what you did went far beyond just doing your job. You left a secure position and attacked superior enemy forces on their own ground with nothing but a rifle and a few grenades. You could have stayed in your hide and called for air support, but instead you chose to risk your life to save mine and my men." The truth was that Sarah had been struggling with her own emotions about the engagement ever since it ended. She had killed more than 40 human beings in a single day, and despite the circumstances, that reality weighed heavily on her conscience. She understood that her actions had been necessary and justified, but the psychological impact of taking so many lives was something she was still processing. "Have you talked to anyone about what happened up there?" Rivera asked, seeming to read her thoughts. "The debriefers, the intelligence analysts, my commanding officer. Everyone wants to know exactly how it happened, what techniques I used, what my thought process was during different phases of the engagement. That's not what I meant. Have you talked to anyone about how you're dealing with it personally?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment. The military had provided access to counselors and psychologists, but she had declined their services. She preferred to handle her own emotional processing, though she was beginning to recognize that might not be the healthiest approach. "I keep thinking about their families," she finally admitted. "Those fighters I killed, they were somebody's sons, maybe somebody's fathers. I know they were trying to kill American soldiers, and I know what I did was necessary, but that doesn't make it easy to live with." Rivera nodded, understanding. "I've been in the military for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like what you did on that mountain. But I've also never met a warrior who didn't struggle with the moral complexity of what we do. The fact that you're thinking about those things tells me you're exactly the kind of person we want protecting American lives. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock on the hospital room door. A Navy captain entered, followed by Sarah's commanding officer, Marine Colonel Janet Martinez. Both senior officers wore serious expressions that immediately put Sarah on alert. Gunnery Sergeant Chun, Captain Reynolds, said formally, "We need to discuss the security classification of your recent actions and their implications for your future assignments." Sarah stood at attention, recognizing that this was not a social visit. Colonel Martinez gestured for her to remain at ease, but Sarah could tell from her commanding officer's body language that this conversation was going to cover sensitive territory. "The engagement you participated in has been classified at the highest levels," Captain Reynolds continued. "The presence of foreign fighters with advanced equipment suggests state sponsorship of Taliban operations in that region. Your actions disrupted what appears to have been a significant intelligence gathering operation directed against American Special Operations Forces. This information cast the mountain engagement in a completely different light." Sarah had assumed she was dealing with a standard Taliban ambush, but if foreign intelligence services were involved, the implications were much more serious. Intelligence analysis of equipment recovered from the battlefield indicates that this was a deliberate attempt to capture or kill American Special Operations personnel for propaganda purposes. The sophistication of the planning and execution suggests months of preparation and significant resources. Colonel Martinez stepped forward to address Sarah directly. "Gunnery Sergeant, your actions not only saved the lives of 12 SEALs, but also prevented a major intelligence disaster. The capture of even one member of SEAL Team 7 could have compromised ongoing operations throughout the region." "What does this mean for me, ma'am?" Sarah asked. Captain Reynolds answered her question. "It means that your identity and your role in this engagement must remain classified indefinitely. You cannot discuss what happened with anyone outside of authorized personnel, and you cannot accept any public recognition for your actions." The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. She would be denied the recognition that her extraordinary actions deserved because the very significance of those actions made public acknowledgement a security risk. It was a price that many military heroes had paid throughout history, but that didn't make it any easier to accept. Additionally, Colonel Martinez continued, "You're being reassigned to a special operations support unit that handles classified missions. Your demonstrated skills and proven ability to operate independently make you ideal for assignments that require the highest levels of capability and discretion." Sarah understood that her life had just changed permanently. The mountain engagement had marked her as an elite warrior capable of extraordinary actions, but it had also marked her as someone who would forever operate in the shadows of classified military operations. "I want you to know," Rivera interjected from his hospital bed, "that every member of my team understands the sacrifices you've made. We may never be able to publicly acknowledge what you did for us, but we'll never forget it. You gave us our lives back, and we owe you everything." As the senior officers departed to allow Rivera to rest, Sarah reflected on how much her world had changed in just 3 weeks. She had gone from being a highly skilled but relatively anonymous Marine sniper to being a classified national asset whose very existence was now a closely guarded secret. But as she looked at Rivera's healing face and thought about Chief Morrison recovering from his wounds in the next room, Sarah knew that every sacrifice had been worth it. 12 American warriors had gone home to their families because of her actions on that mountain, and no amount of recognition or public acknowledgement could be more valuable than that simple fact. The war in Afghanistan would continue, and there would be other mountains, other ambushes, and other desperate situations requiring impossible courage. Sarah Chan would be ready for whatever came next, carrying with her the knowledge that when everything had been on the line, she had not hesitated to risk everything for her fellow warriors. In the end, that was what being a Marine really meant. The willingness to sacrifice everything, including recognition and glory, for the sacred duty of bringing every American fighter home alive. Sarah had proven herself worthy of that calling in the most dramatic way possible, and she would carry that honor with her for the rest of her life, regardless of whether the world ever knew her name.